The Joe Rogan Experience.
This is what I've always wanted to ask you about this. Did you feel physically in danger when that was happening? Because that was such a gigantic moment and so terrifying for most Americans that we're now sure that the government had access to our emails and our phone records, and it was all broken by you and Snowden. And I wondered, like, were you worried for your safety?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for one thing, you know, at the time we were living in a part of Rio that was very isolated. We were living literally on a mountain in the middle of the woods. And, you know, I had with me at all times physically on my person 14 or 15 thumb drives that contained hundreds of thousands, if not more. I've never quantified it on purpose, you know, of the most sensitive documents possessed by the most powerful government on the planet, the most secretive agency within that government. And I would carry them on my person at all times. You know, I would go to the supermarket and just start laughing because on my back would be a backpack filled with, you know, top secret CIA and NSA documents. And obviously there were a lot of people who wanted to get their hands on those documents, not just the US government to take them back, though they realized at some point that that would be impossible, but other governments, non-government actors. But then on top of that, you know, every story that we were doing was affecting markets. It was affecting diplomatic relations. So there was obviously a big interest in a lot of intelligence agencies around the world in what I was doing. And, you know, felt monitored all the time because I was, you know, not like the kind of paranoid feeling of monitoring, but the actual being monitored has been confirmed in a lot of different ways. But, you know, the biggest concern at the time was that the U.S. government, being the U.S. government, got very bullying and very threatening and was explicitly and implicitly, both in public and private, making clear that if I left Brazil, there was a good chance that they would try and arrest me. I mean, remember how extreme they were with Snowden. They brought down the plane of the president of Bolivia when he was coming back from Moscow on the just suspicion that he might have been taking Snowden with him, and of course he wasn't, but that's how extreme they were. So I stayed in Brazil for about 10 months and didn't feel safe leaving. The Justice Department was telling my lawyers, if he leaves and shows up at any airport, we're going to arrest him. And the Brazilian government was super protective of us because a lot of that Snowden reporting revealed how the NSA and the UK and Canada were spying on Brazilian institutions, Brazilian oil companies, the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, the population. So in Brazil, this reporting was looked at very favorably. And so the government, the Senate, offered a lot of protection. So I just felt very safe in Brazil and very unsafe elsewhere.
Well, it's very nice that you felt safe in Brazil. It's very nice that they were protecting you. Do they have a history of monitoring their people the same way the United States does?
Well, so, you know, as I referenced earlier, the history of Brazil, the recent political history is a really dark one, but relevant to the U.S. In the 1950s, early 1960s, they were building the first really vibrant democracy in Latin America, and they were steadfastly attempting to remain neutral in the endless Soviet Union-U.S. Cold War. But in 1963, 1964, they had this kind of center-left president that the U.S. thought was becoming a little too close to Moscow, a little bit too socialist. He, you know, nothing communist, but just very kind of mild reforms like rent control and land reform and some nationalization of companies to try and assuage the really brutal income inequality that has plagued the country forever. And so the U.S. government, first under John Kennedy and then under Lyndon Johnson, worked with right-wing Brazilian generals to overthrow that democratically elected government violently. And they imposed a military dictatorship for the next 21 years, of which the current Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, was a part as an army captain. And those are really dark days. You know, dissidents were murdered, journalists were killed and exiled. Everybody was spied upon with the help of the CIA and MI5 and MI6 in the UK. And so a lot of that kind of endures that relationship between the CIA and the Brazilian government. But since 1985, when it democratized, it's kind of it's become once again a model of a liberal democracy. So no, no government in the world is as obsessed with spying on the world like the US is. But yeah, there's a pretty dark underbelly, like there is in any major country in Brazil, of kind of like a deep state or an intelligence community, whatever you want to call it, that definitely, uses the dark arts to maintain control over the population.
When you hit send, when you finally released, when you put that story out, what was the feeling like? Was there ever a, oh shit, what have I done moment?
No, there's probably should have been, and if I were like healthier from a mental health perspective, there would have been a bigger one of those. But I was in Hong Kong, first of all. We had flown there to meet Snowden. And I wasn't sleeping at all. I mean, obviously I knew it was, going to be one of the biggest stories of that generation, if not the biggest. And I had spent years, Joe, like writing about the NSA and, kind of trying to warn people that it seemed like it was being a lot more invasive and a lot more aggressive about monitoring our private communications and our private activities domestically than either the law permitted or anyone knew. But it was very difficult to sound that alarm because everything was done behind a wall of secrecy. And so when I finally got these documents in my hand, it was like the dream, right? It's why you go into journalism, but especially for me to be able to show the world that everything was so much more extreme than even I thought, that I just wanted to get them out in the world as soon as possible. Like any delay at all on the part of The Guardian, which was the newspaper with which I was working at the time, and reporting, drove me into a rage. I just felt like the world deserved to see these documents. And also, I was so inspired by Snowden. I mean, you've talked to him, I think, twice now. So, he's this 29-year-old kid at the time who pretty much gambled. We thought 95% likelihood he was going to end up in prison, not for a few years, but for the rest of his life. And like not in a nice prison, but in the kind of prison that you go in when they accuse you of jeopardizing American national security. But he did it because he believed in the cause. Like that was not the bullshit reason, like not the movie script reason. Like that was his genuine, which shocked me, right? Was this jaded reporter who kept looking for the real motive, but that was it. There was no other motive. And so I just felt like I owed him such a duty, and kind of inspired by his example, I thought, if he's willing to go to prison for the rest of his life, and he chose me to work with him, that courage kind of became infectious. And we kind of adopted this trench bunker mentality, like we were in this together and we were going to fight everybody. And that became the energy much more, and it kind of drowned out the fears that probably were rational for us to have.
I felt very honored and very, very fortunate to be able to talk to him. And I think he's a very noble person, unusually noble. And in long-form conversations, if there was any hint of something different, I really believe it would have leaked out. He really is that guy. And I think history, when we look upon this case, I mean, the documentary was pretty excellent, that showed all the moments leading up to you releasing the story. But I think these conversations with him, I just feel very fortunate to have that platform where he's willing to come on and talk for hours at a time and express his thoughts on just on spying in general, national security issues, and all of these situations that he faced up to and now currently because of that. It's embarrassing that this is the world that we live in, this is the country that we live in, that man, who I really genuinely believe is a hero, is now a Russian citizen forever.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully there's an opportunity, just because of all the bizarre, vindictive impulses that Trump has, and the fact that by complete coincidence, the people who want Snowden to be in Russia forever or to rot in prison happen to be Trump's enemies as well, that I'm hoping there's an opportunity to persuade Trump after the election, particularly if he loses, but even if he doesn't, that he should follow through on what he's now twice bizarrely raised on his own, which was the prospect of pardoning Snowden. It's something it's probably my top priority in the world at the moment. And the reason is what you just said, which is, we're so accustomed to people doing things for just misguided reasons, corrupted reasons, people lying and deceiving about why they're doing things, about presenting a false version of who they are. And that's the thing is, you talk to him for those hours. When I got to Hong Kong, before becoming a journalist, I was a litigator in Manhattan, and I used those skills. I kind of created a little mini Guantanamo where I just like put him in front of me and just questioned him for 8 hours straight, 3 straight days, without letting him even have a glass of water or go to the bathroom, because I really wanted to know what was actually motivating him. Who was this person to whom I was about to tie myself and my reputation and credibility eternally? And he really is somebody who, and like the thing about it too is like that's so amazing about it is that oftentimes people who leak secrets or who become a source that, wants to expose secrets and are willing to go to prison are often kind of fucked up people, right? They're like alienated from society. They feel persecuted and mistreated. They don't have much going on in their lives and therefore don't feel like they have a lot to risk. Snowden was exactly the opposite. He had at the time this incredibly beautiful and brilliant girlfriend who today is his wife. They had been together for years. And in order to do what he did, he had to deceive her. He had to leave the country and not tell her what he was doing because he wanted to make certain that when the government knocked on her door, she could truthfully say she knew nothing about it, because he knew they would go after her if they could tie her to it. He had a great job. He was making a lot of money. He was a high school dropout, but had taught himself these really coveted skills. So he had a great career ahead of him, a mother and a father who both love him, very stable home life. He had none of those traits, that typically are used to demonize people who do this, which is why I knew he was going to be gold from a media perspective and to be able to prevent the government from demonizing him in the way they like to do. But more importantly than that, like leaving aside all the perception stuff and all the PR and media stuff, he's probably the person, or one of the people certainly I admire most in this world in all the time I've lived. And what's so unbelievable, people always say to me, oh, poor Snowden, he's trapped in Russia. He can't come home. He's facing multiple felony charges. He's been separated from all of which is true. But like, I also always say that he's the person who I know in this world who, when he puts his head down on his pillow at night, he falls asleep most easily. Because there's something about knowing that you face this dangerous choice and you chose the right thing. I mean, in Hong Kong, as I said, I was never sleeping. My colleague or Poitras was never sleeping. We were sleeping like an hour or two with the aid of very strong sleep narcotics. And, he would say, like at 9:30, he would yawn. He would say, okay, guys, I think I'm going to hit the hay. Like he had no care in the world. And I was like, what the fuck? And he would like sleep for 8 hours, and he would wake up, have a little coffee. But that's what that, clean conscience does to a person.
Even with a clean conscience, I just don't understand the weight of the stress that he was under. I don't understand how he could be so calm.
He didn't have stress. That's what's so bizarre. I mean, you saw in the film, right, in the documentary, Citizen4, where like, because we had no idea what the CIA knew. We had no idea what the Chinese government knew. We had no idea what Hong Kong authorities knew. We were waiting. I was always waiting for the door to be kicked in at any moment, and for him at least, if not the rest of us, me and Laura, to be taken away. And like I said, our working assumption the whole time was that there was, as excited as I was, the one thing that was kind of a dark cloud that hovered over it all the time was that this person who I had now become connected with and developed an admiration for, I was certain at any moment he was going to be in the hands of the U.S. government. And the next time I would see him would be on television in an orange jumpsuit and shackles in a courtroom, getting ready to be sentenced to like 50 years in prison in one of those hellholes that the U.S. specializes in, where you spend 23 and a half hours a day alone in your cell. And you have 30 minutes a day where you get to walk in a little room in the sun to satisfy legal requirements. And that was going to be him for the rest of his life. He got very lucky. He almost did end up that way. So for me, I was, concerned for him, stressed for him, but he was at peace with the fact that that was the path he chose. It wasn't like, and that was really important for me to know that he had thought through all the likely consequences. I didn't want to feel like I was using somebody's work product who hadn't given full thought to what it is that they had gotten themselves into. And it was only once I became very, he could cite the statutes with which they were going to charge him and what the legal defenses that were available were. So he had given extreme thought to this. He's an adult and he made that choice. And it was amazing. To this very day, he's completely at peace with it.
Episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience are now free on Spotify. That's right, they're free. From September 1st to December 1st, they're going to be available everywhere. But after December 1st, they will only be available on Spotify, but they will be free. That includes the video. The video will also be there. It'll also be free. That's all we're asking. Just go download Spotify. Much love. Bye-bye.